Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. This video will be a video that continues my exposition of the basic outlines of covenant theology. This video will talk about the famous three divisions of the law: moral, ceremonial, and civil. And then we'll take up that weighty topic: should we go to Moses to get sanctified, or should we stay with the law of Christ in the New Testament? If you're interested in more videos concerning New Covenant theology, including a discussion of dispensationalism and covenant theology, as well as an exposition of New Covenant theology, I would invite you to look at this playlist, look it up on YouTube, and you will find probably be more than you'll ever need to know about the subject. I hope you enjoy this video, which, as I said, will be about the three divisions of the law according to the Covenant Theologians, and we will look at the problem of sanctification. Are we sanctified by the law, or are we sanctified by the Holy Spirit of Christ? I hope you enjoy it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as I said in my last video, I talked about the three main covenants of covenant theology: the covenant of works with Adam in the Garden of Eden, the covenant of grace, which goes from the fall of Adam all the way to the end of time, and which covers the Mosaic covenant, the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant, the covenant of Christ. And that covenant of grace is supposed to cover all of that period. And then I gave a brief historical overview of covenant theology and how it got codified into the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, in this video, we will first look at the three divisions of the law. And I'm also going to do, is there a continuing validity of the law of Moses for sanctification? That'll keep us busy. The next video, I'm going to have to do the next two videos on the topic of the Church of Spiritual Israel. So let's start now with the three divisions of the law. All right, well, according to the Covenant Theologians, the Mosaic law is divided into the civil law, the ceremonial law, and the moral law. The civil law are laws against murder, rape, and robbery, the typical penal code in any society today. Any secular jurisdiction is going to have this type of laws, and Moses had them too. And then there are the ceremonial laws, which are laws regulating ritual sacrifices. For example, which animals do you sacrifice for a peace offering, and which animals, and how do you sacrifice animals for the whole burnt offering, and that kind of thing. And also the festivals and the feast and all of that, who ate what. Now, of course, this was unique for Israel. You don't find this kind of law in other law codes in the world. And then there's the moral law, which is supposedly to be, according to covenant theologians, law which reflects the nature of God, and which was put into the Mosaic law, and which is exclusively adumbrated in the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments are moral law, and those Ten Commandments were also put into Adam and Eve at the time in the garden. And the Ten Commandments were put into the hearts of Gentiles, as it's written into their conscience, and it's also carried forth into the New Covenant in the law of Christ. Now, this threefold division of the law was mentioned by Aquinas, but it was, it was not only mentioned, it was mentioned and defended by Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic Church in the 1300s, but the Protestant Reformation didn't deal with this. John Calvin mentioned it once, I think, but it's began to be more and more appealed to as time went on after the Reformation. And by the time you get to the Westminster Confession of Faith, it's actually written into the confession, and you'll talk to any Reformed person today, and they will hold on to this like a gun advocate will wrap his cold, dead fingers around his firearm and say, "You'll not take it away from me until my cold, dead fingers are relaxed in death." That is how strong this idea is amongst Reformed theologians. And there's a reason for it. Because if you could say that the law can be divided into civil, ceremonial, and moral law, you can say, when in the New Testament Paul says all these nasty things about the law, he says we're not under the law, the law leads to sin, the law produces sin, we're not under the law. The Reformed could say, well, he was just talking about the civil and ceremonial law. He wasn't trying to get us out from the moral law. God forbid, we don't want to have sex with donkeys. And that's typically the way the Reformed argue. But if the law is a unit, and Paul says we're not under the law, and the book of Hebrews says the law has been done away with, well then, if it's a unit, that means the moral law goes, and we have to have a replacement, which is the law of Christ, according to New Covenant Theology. So there's your background here. Now, God's moral law is also God's law written on the hearts of men. I think I just mentioned that. I always call that the law of conscience, the natural law, the divine law. I don't know what you call it. I've called it the moral law too, but the Covenant Theologians, they use that term moral law in a sort of an overarching sense. It's everywhere. It's in Adam and Eve's heart. It's in the Ten Commandments. It's just everywhere. So we're not going to use that. I'm not going to use that phrase. I'm just going to talk about the law of conscience written on men's hearts when I want to talk about the Gentiles and the law that they're condemned by. I mean, I just read a Reformed theologian, Michael Ware, who said that the moral law is placed in the hearts of Gentiles, including the Ten Commandments. And I thought, well, do you mean that Gentiles are supposed to worship on Saturday? Really? Interesting idea. All right, so why is this distinction so important to covenant theologians? As I just said, it allows them to do two contradictory things. First of all, they can set Christians free from the law. Yes, we're free from the law, but when we say that, we mean the civil and ceremonial law. And this is what I would always ask any Reformed person. Where in the Bible does Paul ever say, you're free from the civil and ceremonial law, but you're not free from the moral law? That is an assumption. That is an assumption that Reformed people make without even thinking about it, but I don't make it, and I challenge any Reformed person to show me where the distinction is. And then at the same time, they want to get us free from the civil and ceremonial law. They want to put Christians under the law, under the law in the sense of the moral law, which is at Moses. And this is their strong point, because they always say, hey, we don't want to be antinomian. We don't want to be free to have sex with donkeys and rob banks now, do we? To commit adultery. And of course, the answer to that is we are not antinomian. We are under the law of Christ. And the law of Christ is every bit as strict as the law of Moses, and in fact, stricter in many cases. All right, so that's the rationale behind the threefold distinction of the law. Now, I'm going to look at three subtopics here. First, the Old Testament mixes the three types. And what I'm going to try to show there is that you can't distinguish the moral, the civil, and ceremonial law in the Old Testament. You just can't. Because the law itself mixes them all up, and it's very hard to pick out which is moral, sometimes, which is moral, which is ceremonial, and which is civil. And in fact, the second part of this, subpart of this division, is that covenant theologians do not know what the moral law is. They will quibble, they will debate. Exactly what do we call the moral law? That's because it's not in the Bible, and it doesn't say so in the Bible, so theologians are free to pontificate and debate. And then the third subdivision under this section of three divisions of the law, the New Testament scriptures unify the three divisions. We'll look at scriptures that show that there's no distinction between the moral, civil, and ceremonial law. All right, starting first, number one, the Old Testament mixes the three types of laws. Let's look at Exodus 22:19 through 24. And I'll say that if you look on the internet, you can find that if you research this topic, this passage is quoted a lot, so I'm going to quote it too. This passage mixes all three. We'll start out with the moral laws that it says, Exodus 22:19. Whoever lies with an animal should be put to death. My sentiments exactly. That's a moral law. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Well, that's moral law. Idolatry. You shall not, verse 23, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Treat people nicely. That's a moral law. Verse 22, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. The widows and orphans, take care of them. That's moral. Verse 23, if you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. That's obviously moral. And then, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Why? If you mistreat widows and orphans, it shows that God was pretty concerned about that. Moral law, no problem. But then right in the middle of the moral law, we go to verse 25. And let's go down from 25 to verse 29. Verse 25 says this, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Now, this is obviously a civil law. It's a law against usury. We have usury laws in the law codes of every state in this nation. We don't say you can't charge any interest, but there are limits on to what interest can be charged, and it's a very similar thing. So that's obviously a civil law, mixed right in with the moral law. Here's another civil law. In verse 26, in Exodus chapter 22, if ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. Now that's talking about how you deal with collateral on a loan. Again, every state in the nation has got laws on that. Uniform Commercial Code, chapter 2, talks about that, if I remember correctly. There's certain things that you can do and not do when you repossess somebody's car when he hadn't paid his loan back, and so forth. So that's a civil law. We have those type of laws in modern society. Verse 27, continuing with this idea about the neighbor's cloak being taken in pledge, it is his only covered, and it is his cloak for his body, and what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Again, that means you got to be easy on taking people's collateral. Like in America, you can't throw people in jail if they don't pay their debts back like you used to could. All right, verse 28. Now we go back to the moral law. You shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people. Well, that's a moral law. You don't treat God blasphemously. And now, this moral law is sandwiched between a civil law and a ceremonial law, because in verse 29, Moses says this: you shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Well, that's obviously ceremonial law. That has to do with the Mosaic ritual and cultus and all the stuff they had to do Levitically. Ceremonial. It's not moral. It's not a moral thing that we're supposed to lay a few sheaves of cotton to the government before we harvest the rest of the crop. We would never say that would be a civil law. And it's certainly not immoral today in society not to cut down a crop and give it to the government. We would say a person was immoral for doing that. And then we get to another ceremonial law in verse 30. You shall do the same. That means offer from the first fruits. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. Obviously ceremonial. So you see, civil, moral, ceremonial, all mixed together. Moses did not make this distinction. An Old Testament Jew had to obey all of the law, and if he violated a ceremonial law, he had committed a moral transgression against his God. All right, let's move on to the second subpart of this section, the three divisions of the law. Subsection number 2, covenant theologians do not know what the moral law is. Now, here's some options given by covenant theologians. Option 1, what's the 10 Commandments? Now, the Westminster Confession of Faith holds this as the moral laws in the 10 Commandments. Now, of course, the big problem with that is it's really 9 commandments, which are obviously moral, but the 4th commandment, well, I say obviously moral, at least arguably moral. I will concede that they're moral. Some of them sound an awful lot like civil laws, like the laws against perjury. But anyway, we'll say it's all moral. But not the 4th commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There's not a moral thing about that. All covenant theologians will say it's a moral thing. If we don't worship God on Saturday, of course they have to switch it to Sunday, which makes their argument even weaker. If you don't worship on Saturday, then by golly, you are violating God's moral law. And of course, as a practical matter, you ask the average Presbyterian what that means. They don't know. Some of them will watch ball games. Some of them will go out and play croquet. I mean, they'll do anything. They'll go shopping at the mall. Some of them will cut the grass. It's a meaningless moral law, if it's a moral law, even to Reformed covenant people. They can't practice it. They can't practice what they preach. It's much easier, in my opinion, to say that the 4th commandment is a ceremonial law and it's been abrogated, as the Reformed people like to say. Ceremonial law has been abrogated when we get to the law of Christ. All right, some covenant theologians say that the moral law is contained in the 2 great commandments in the Old Testament law. In Deuteronomy 6:5, where we're supposed to love God, or I should say the Jews back then under that law were supposed to love God. And I know we're supposed to love God too in the New Covenant, but it's a different law that tells me to love God. And love your neighbor, Leviticus 19:18. And so the moral law is supposed to be contained in that. John Calvin held that. Here's a third option: all the laws of Moses that are not civil or ceremonial. And I would tend, if I was Reformed, which I'm not, but if I was a covenant theology person, I would say, yeah, I'll go with that. But the problem is how do I know what law is civil or ceremonial? Sometimes it's not so easy to tell. All right, so that's you see the problem here, that covenant theologians have a little bit of problem of putting their finger on what the moral law is. Now let's go to a quotation from John M. Frame, who I'm sure you know is an eminent Reformed scholar. I think he taught at Reformed Theological Seminary West out in California. Here's what he says. What we call moral laws are mixed together in the text, almost randomly it seems, with civil and ceremonial laws. Literal and non-literal applicability is a matter of degree, so we may expect some gray areas, some laws that do not fit neatly into categories. Well, here's a Reformed guy agreeing with me. You can't distinguish the ceremonial and moral and civil laws. You just can't. Not always. Now, sometimes you can, but it's okay. I mean, even if you can make the distinction, it's not a distinction that means anything because it's all part of one package, the law. And sometimes you can't make the distinction. Here's a quote from Willem A. Van Gimmeren, who's an eminent Reformed scholar. He taught at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School after I graduated from there. I think he's still there. He says this: the moral laws, i.e. those reflected in the Decalogue, are intertwined with the civil laws, the penal code, and the ceremonial laws. In other words, you can't distinguish them out. Now, he mentions the penal code here. I ought to mention this too. Sometimes Reformed people will say, if you're not under the law, they say, okay, we'll grant that you can't make a distinction between the civil, the moral, and the ceremonial law. You can't make that distinction, however, when we'll say that the law is a unit, but when Paul says that we are not under the law, what he means is we're not under the sanctions of the law. We're not under the punishments of the law, but we are under the law as a moral guide for our rule of life. Well, now you've divided the law up between its requirements and its punishments. Well, I want to tell you something. There's no law in the world. You take any civil jurisdiction, show me the law that doesn't have a sanction attached to it. You can't have law without sanction. It's a nothing burger. It doesn't make any sense. And so Van Gimmeren makes the point that penal sections about what the punishments are intertwined right in there with the civil law. He might have meant the criminal law as opposed to civil laws like bailments and theft and things like that. Doesn't make any difference. It's all, you can't split it out. You can't logic chop it. All right, now let's go then to the third subsection of this part of our video, the three divisions of the law. In this subsection, I'm going to make the point that the New Testament scriptures unify these three divisions of the law. For example, here's a quote from F.F. Bruce. Again, it is sometimes said that Christ is the end of the ceremonial law. This is what Reformed people say, and that's who Bruce is referring to. This, says Bruce, has no place in Pauline exegesis. It has to be read into Paul, for it is not a distinction that Paul himself makes. Well, it's certainly not a distinction. It's not a distinction that Moses made either. And it's not a distinction that anybody that reads the Bible should make. It is just a distinction that people who are hung up on the Westminster Confession of Faith make. It has to be read into Paul. And that's what the Westminster Confession of Faith did. They read it into Paul. That's what all Reformed people do. They shove it right in there, their assumptions, and say, see there, ceremonial, civil, and ceremonial law. No, it's not there. Let's look at some scripture that says the same thing. James chapter 2, verse 10, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. Where's the distinction that James makes? He's referring to people under the Old Testament law, and if you don't shave your beard right, by golly, you're guilty of the whole thing. You can't divide out the ceremonial from the moral. If you plant tomatoes and peas in the same garden, by golly, you're guilty. And if you put a tattoo on your beautiful body, by golly, you're guilty of the whole law. And if you don't show up in Jerusalem for one of the for the three feasts, you're guilty of the whole law. There's no distinction. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I got a little bit ambitious at the beginning of this video, said I was going to do part 4 here, the continuing validity of the law of Moses for sanctification. That actually goes through a lot of scripture. I'll take that up in a separate video, and I'm going to close this video down right here.